In today's video, we will show you how we replaced the old ceiling insulation and then reinstalled the ceiling panels. We'll show you how we finished off the bus walls with plywood, and then we show you how we built the recording studio walls and ceiling, complete with sound insulation.
Alright, so it's time to put our ceiling on the bus, and we have been thinking about how to do that. And we've seen a lot of Skoolies out there. They have done a beautiful job putting wood for ceiling, and it looks really amazing, and we really like that. But that also means that it's going to cost more money. And we've been going back and forth. Do we put the same sheet metal that we had here on the bus originally, or do we go with wood? And now that we're far into the conversion, you know, a lot of things were more expensive than what we expected. And we decided that we're gonna go with the old sheet metal. It's gonna be cheaper and we need to save money. In the meantime that we're working right here, we have Claudia outside prepping the old panels, just washing them, degreasing them, and then sanding them lightly. So then when we have them installed over here, we're gonna repaint all of them. So the next step will be to do the insulation, and Cora is in charge of doing the insulation.
What we're gonna use on the insulation for the ceiling is the mineral wool. Which is great for essentially every panel from here forward, but we realized the panels here are like a mesh, and if we just put mineral wool and then this mesh metal, then we run the risk of having a lot of this fiber in our air, and it's not good to breathe. So we decided what we're going to do is essentially put a layer of the mineral wool, and then this is the old insulation from the ceiling. It's not really insulation, it's more just for sound isolation, but it's basically nylon. So if we take just kind of the top panel from these, then we'll be able to create a cap. So we'll be able to use the mineral wool on the ceiling like we want, but then have a cap so that we're not breathing all of that stuff in every day.
We started this process by using masking tape to hold the insulation and nylon layer in place. Then we sealed off all the edges where rock wool dust could get through with aluminum tape. Then we started the sheet metal installation by first adding screws in key areas to hold the panel in place, while we made sure that the rest of the holes aligned correctly. This was a tedious process because it's hard to make all the holes align. You have to keep reshifting the panel until all the holes align correctly. Sometimes this means that you have to remove screws and start all over again. This is a process that has to be done with at least one other person to make it easier and faster. Even better when you have an awesome friend there to help you. This process took us several days, as we were also working on other aspects of the bus conversion. Before we reinstalled the metal panels, we made sure that they were properly sanded and cleaned. That way they would be ready for painting after they were installed. To make any paint job last, it's all about the prep, especially when you're painting metal. To learn about the tried and true prep process we used every time we painted metal, both in the interior and exterior of the bus, check out this video. By the way, the rock wool comes in 3.5-inch thick batting, but the space between the roof and the ceiling is only 2 inches. So we built a frame to help us reduce the batting to a consistently 2-inch thickness. You'll need a stone wool insulation knife for this. We include a link to it below.
After 5 long days of putting this metal ceiling panels back into the bus, we are about to install the last one. It has been extremely hard because of all these screws that you see over here. Sometimes they match, sometimes they don't. And if you have one side that matches and then you have another side that doesn't, you have to unscrew everything and kind of start all over again. We have installed 6 in total. And the last one is gonna be a little more tricky than the rest because we have this rooftop AC unit right here. And I had to cut a perfect hole to go around here so that it can be installed correctly. So we did some very precise measurements with Cora, and I think we are right on the spot with these measurements. So we have the opening for the AC right here. These are some openings for the studs for the studio walls, and then I gotta cut a little tiny bit on each corner. So let me go get my grinder and cut this thing out. All right, the first part was cut successfully. All right, let's get this last panel up.
We had to make sure to not forget the electrical wires that had to go through some of the panels. We also had to make sure not to accidentally cut any of the wires on the side of the bus, right above the windows, with the edges of the panels, because those edges were pretty sharp.
All right, so the AC cover is installed. It looks like we're gonna have to do a couple of adjustments just because, as you can see right here, we have a slight curve on the roof, and there's a gap in there. Maybe I'll put some gasket or something like that. And also here, this is supposed to be sealed. Maybe add an extra piece of gasket to go right here. But other than that, we just have to wait for the electrician to come and do the electrical connection, and we have this AC pretty soon. Beautiful.
As soon as we finished up with the ceiling, we moved on to finishing up the sidewalls of the bus. We started at the workshop with my brother-in-law Jairo, cutting the pieces of plywood that would later cover the insulation. Here we are back in the bus installing those last pieces of insulation before we cover it with plywood. To be able to screw the plywood to the frame of the bus, we installed 1.5-inch strips of wood to the metal frame of the bus using sheet metal screws. These strips of wood created a wooden frame to easily screw the plywood to. During this process, we learned that when using screws on hardwood and metal, it's always better to pre-drill a pilot hole, even if you are using self-tapping screws. We had many broken screw heads, and that slowed us down quite a bit. So it's always smart to pre-drill a hole if possible.
Okay, so today is a really exciting day, especially for me, because it is when we begin the official build out of the studio. So right now we're working on the floor. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a green glue sandwich, as we're calling it. We have plywood already down on the floor, and we're going to apply green glue. It's a noise dampening compound. So you apply that between two rigid layers, plywood, green glue, plywood. So we're going to do that across the floor, and that will help a lot with stopping sounds from coming into the studio through the floor, and from my sounds that we make in here going out.
Yeah, and essentially we have to do the same thing with the walls. We have this structure right here to hold one of our walls, and we have exactly the same thing on the other side of the bus. And then we have the windows side of the bus that also are going to have a sandwich, 1/2-inch plywood, 2.5-inch plywood with a green glue in the middle, and that's going to give us some soundproofing. And on top of that, we're going to have the rest of the soundproofing material, which we're thinking of using rock wool.
Yep.
For this process, it was very important to add the right amount of glue per the manufacturer's instructions, and then to spread it evenly on the floor before adding the top layer of plywood. We then secured the plywood layers together using wood screws.
So last night we did the floor for the interior of the studio. We already had the subfloor. All we had to do is apply the green glue and the layer of 1/2-inch plywood, sandwiching the glue in between the two layers of plywood. And today we are going to do the walls. We already got the template. So we have our template right here, made out of cardboard. We already cut one sheet of plywood with my brother Hyder right here, who came to help me today. So we have one already cut. It fits perfectly. So we're gonna have the same thing over here. We're gonna have half an inch of plywood as the first layer. Then we're gonna apply the green glue, and then another layer of half an inch plywood. And it's gonna be the same thing for all the walls, the back walls over there, this wall over here, and also the sidewall right here on the side of the bus. So let's get to it because we're gonna need the studio very soon.
Ya, ponte hasta allá.
¿Ese ya la fue a atornillar, Luis? Sí, ya lo voy a atornillar.
Yo he cortado esta atornillar. Tengo que ahora lo mejor, ¿viste?
A good tip for cutting plywood to match the curve of your bus is to use a piece of cardboard as a template. You can start with a rough cut on the cardboard and then refine it until it matches the curve perfectly. Then use that template to mark the plywood and cut it perfectly to size. Using an electric jigsaw makes this job a breeze.
Today we are going to be working on the side walls of the bus, and for that we have to create a framing for the insulation that's going to go right here, and also as a part of the entire structural frame of the studio. We have a little bit of a problem right here with the insulation because at the bottom right here we have more space, and because of the windows, these side walls, they tilt in a little bit inside the bus. We're not going to have enough space right here to insulate. So we have some material that's going to help us a little bit with that.
So our solution is in this spot where the wall kind of tilts in so that the stud, there's not a ton of room for the insulation that we're going to use. What we're going to put there as our next layer of defense is some mass-loaded vinyl. We're going to use this stuff. It's nice and heavy duty with a cush here, which actually acts as like a decoupling surface. So we're going to put these in here like so, which is going to help stop a lot of the sound coming through in the space where the insulation is pretty weak. And we're also going to be using mass-loaded vinyl around the sockets and all the places where we have our switches and our outlets. That's going to be wrapped in mass-loaded vinyl to help. We're also going to use vibration. This is like a vibration foam. It's an isolating pad essentially. So in places where the framework is meeting kind of like the outside frame of the bus, we're going to be using little patches of this stuff to help isolate our inside framing from the outside frame of the bus.
So these walls right here are going to be a little different. They're going to be reversed in comparison to this wall. This wall right here, they're going to have some extra framing to tuck the insulation in there. And then we are gonna cover them with raw canvas to hold the insulation in place. In other words, these walls, this wall right here and this wall right here, will be soft walls. These ones are gonna be reversed. The insulation is going to go against the frame of the bus, the windows and everything else. And then we're gonna have a hard wall, which is gonna be a sandwich of green glue with plywood. Yeah, and this is not gonna be just a recording studio. This is also going to be our bedroom. So there's going to be other things that are going to be absorbing the sound. The reason why we're going to go with a hard wall right here is because if you do it the same way as this one, we're going to be losing a lot of space, and the insulation is not going to be as even if we do it this way. So it's kind of hard, you know, building the studio inside a space like this bus where it's really hard to get right angles and to move things around. I mean, we cannot move this. We cannot get this straight. The only way is to make it straight right here, but then we lose space in some areas. So hopefully this will work for us and it will be soundproof enough for it to make amazing music.
So we also wanted to give a huge shout out to Sound Corporation. They helped us a lot with finding the right MLB products and helping by donating a little bit of this mass-loaded vinyl for our project. So we just want to thank them very, very much for their help in bringing this studio to life.
We built the frame using 2x2s, secured together with both L brackets and screws. The frame was built to fit the largest pieces of insulation possible to minimize cutting and using lots of separate, smaller pieces of insulation. This frame will hold the insulation in place, and it also is what we screw the green glue sandwich to. Next, we cut the mass-loaded vinyl, MLV, to fit the size of the upper part of the windows. Then we secured the MLV on the upper windows using a construction adhesive that works on glass. For this, we used Loctite PL 530. As always, prep is everything. It's really important to always clean a surface well before gluing anything to it. This will guarantee maximum adhesion. Then we used duct tape to keep the MLV in place as the adhesive cured. By the way, the windows behind the studio walls were locked and permanently sealed shut with 100% silicone. As you can see, we've already installed 2 inches of rock wool to the sidewall right below the windows. This will be in addition to the final layer of 3.5 inch thick rock wool covering the entire wall. Next, we installed the rock wool insulation on the supporting frame. We left this layer of insulation at its original 3.5 inch thickness. And finally, we installed the 1/2 inch plywood that would later be turned into another green glue sandwich. This plywood was screwed directly to the wooden frame. This is the side of the studio where there will eventually be a Murphy bed. So here we are creating a green glue sandwich along the wall. The white caulking you see is acoustic caulking, which we use to seal anywhere there is a seam between 2 pieces of plywood. We also staggered the second sheets of plywood, much like you stagger bricks when making a wall. This was so that there was no direct conduit to the outside of the bus. Then we repeated the same steps on the other wall. This is the side of the studio that will hold a desk for the recording gear and a piano. You can see the outlet that is installed on the wall for that purpose.
Okay, so we've got the other wall of the studio up and framed, so we wanted to take a moment and show you the construction before it starts being filled up and everything. So we've got the frame here, it's pretty sturdy, and this is essentially what's going to be holding the safe and sound insulation in place. And then the plywood wall is going to be up against this. So you can see we've got some mass-loaded vinyl here covering the top windows where the sound insulation is going to be pretty thin. And actually, we wanted to show you behind this top strip, we have a strip of mass-loaded vinyl, and in some places it's mass-loaded vinyl coupled with like a vibration foam. And the point with that is to try and isolate as much of these points where the frame is really hard against the outside of the bus, to provide some sort of barrier to help stop a lot of noise coming directly through those areas where this is touching. Because you can see the rest of this place, most of the rest of the frame is not touching the outside of the bus. There's a few places where it is, and that's just inevitable. But it should be, we're doing a pretty good job of trying to isolate this wall, this framing, from the outside of the bus. So what I'm doing is I'm going to add this MLV. It's kind of MLV sandwiched between foam, and it has a sticky surface here. And so what I'm going to be doing is fastening this just behind this metal, outlet box, simply because this is going to be an open space that really is like a direct conduit directly into the studio. So we have to look at what's the defense behind this. We're basically going to have some sound insulation behind it, but it's only going to be around 3 inches, and this is like a direct bridge into the studio. So if we can kind of isolate it as much as possible, that'll reduce as much as we can, this being a bridge for sound to be able to just come straight into the studio. So this stuff, it's really great because you've got mass-loaded vinyl in there, which is a great barrier. But then also you have this bit of foam there that will kind of serve as a vibration absorber, you might. So Make sure I position this well. Yeah. Right, like so.
If you're watching this video because you're trying to build a studio inside your bus, van, or tiny home, chances are you've already learned the basic principles of soundproofing. You can see that we tried to cover as many of them as we could. Using MLV and half-inch sheets of plywood in the studio was all about increasing mass. Green glue is all about damping. Rock wool was for absorption, not only inside the walls, but also in the form of soft walls in the studio, which of course lessens the amount of reflections inside the studio itself. The closest we got to decoupling was creating those inner frames that touched the bus frame as little as possible. And wherever they did, vibration foam provided at least some buffer. No matter what space you're building inside, try to cover as many of these principles as possible: mass, damping, absorption, and decoupling. After finishing the walls, we got to work on the ceiling. We followed a similar process as the sidewalls. We installed strips of wood to run perpendicular to the metal ribs of the bus, and everywhere a wooden strip met a metal rib of the bus, we stuck a small piece of vibration foam between the two. After we installed the wooden strips, we installed the sound insulation, using masking tape to keep it in place. Finally, we installed sheets of bendable plywood, which served as the inner ceiling of the studio.
All right, so we are ready to put the ceiling panels up. We got this bendable plywood. Let's see if it's gonna fit after we made some cuts.
Because the ceiling is curved, it was hard to make accurate measurements for the size of the bendable plywood. So we had the bus parked right outside the wood shop, so we could use a table saw to make as many adjustments as were needed. Since this was going to be the finished surface of the ceiling, we had to be really careful with the way we installed the bendable plywood. We had to handle it with care so it didn't get scratched, and we used a combination of regular screws and invisible nails to secure it to the wooden frame. Finally, we used staples along every seam where two pieces of bendable plywood met. This kept the seams even in relation to one another. Of course, there was more that went into building the studio after the walls and ceiling were done, so stay tuned for those videos coming up. Hey guys, make sure you check out the step-by-step tutorial that goes with this video. It walks you through the process and also includes links to all the tools and materials shown in the video. The link is in the description. If you have any questions, drop us a comment below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our conversion tutorials.